1958, after being indicted on drug conspiracy charges, Carmine goes into hiding. An article in the New York Herald Tribune, dated January 8, 1958, claims he had fled to Italy to link up and seek refuge with Lucky Luciano, for whom he used to run drugs in Harlem. Another report had him meeting up with Joe Adonis, another major ex-New York mobster, living in exile in Italy. By April of 1958, he was back in New York and reportedly staying in Suite 10A of the All Ray Hotel on East 64th Street. And by 1959, the Catroni brothers were supplying Carmine and Big John Ormento with up to 50 kilos of pure heroin a month. In July of that year, he was indicted as part of a major and complex drug bust carried out by the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. Among the many mobsters who were hauled in on this were Vito Genovese, Big John Ormento, and Vincent the Chin Gigante. Released on bail, Carmine goes on the lam, remaining free until June 2nd, 1959. On June 3rd, 1959, New Jersey State Police officers arrested Carmine after stopping his car on the Garden State Parkway, close to New York City. Federal agents had recently discovered that Carmine had been hiding in a house on Pelican Island, off the Jersey shore. With him in the car were his cousins, Angelo Presenzano, Little Mo, or Moe, if that's your preference, and Anthony Macalusco. On June 3rd, Carmine is released on $100,000 bail. His lawyers, they were able to delay any further legal proceedings for almost 2 years. It wasn't until May 17th, 1960, that Carmine was formally indicted, pleading not guilty, and again was released on bail. During this period, he was living at 40 Park Avenue in Manhattan. He finally went to trial on January 20th of 61. The presiding judge, Thomas F. Murphy, revoked his bail, ordering Carmine behind bars. On May 15th, a mistrial was declared. It seemed the foreman of the jury, Harry Appel, a 68-year-old dress manufacturer, had the misfortune of falling down a flight of stairs in a building on 15th Street in Lower Manhattan. After the medics arrived and Appel was taken to a nearby hospital, it was determined he had suffered a broken back. There were no witnesses to Harry Appel's fall, nor did he say anyone had pushed him, and although they had no definite proof, the authorities believed that Appel had been pushed by a cohort of Carmine's. This time, Carmine was allowed bail, and so he goes free on bond of $135,000. Now, his second trial begins April of 1962, and there was chaos in the courtroom. One of the defendants, Anthony Mira, an upcoming associate in the Bonanno family, this guy, equally as vicious and unstable as Carmine, he picks up a chair and hurls it at the prosecutor. It missed the prosecutor and smashed into the jury box, forcing the frightened jurors to scatter in all directions. Other defendants screamed and shouted throughout the proceeding, but in the end, to no avail, Carmine was found guilty. On July 10th of 1962, he was sentenced to 20 years in prison. The U.S. Congress had passed a draconian Narcotics Control Act in 1956, signed by President Eisenhower on July 18th, and Carmine was one of 206 big-time mafia gangsters caught by authorities under this law. Carmine was held in the Federal Detention Center at 427 West Street in New York before being sent first to Alcatraz Prison, which was located on an island fortress in San Francisco Bay. He was then moved to the Lewisburg Penitentiary in Leavenworth, Kansas, before serving the final years of his prison term in the United States Penitentiary in Atlanta, Georgia. It would be the longest time he was to spend behind bars. While in prison, Carmine made it known when he got out of prison, he was going to take control of the New York Mafia by the throat. The proclaimed head of the commission, the governing body of the Mafia at the time, was Carlo Gambino, boss of the Gambino crime family. Carlo Gambino was shrewd and generally quiet and reserved. He was well respected for his business acumen and his ability to keep peace amongst his own family, as well as the other mafia families. Carmine had no use for Carlo Gambino or his method of doing business. He once told an inmate in jail that when he hit the streets again, he'd make Carlo Gambino shit in the middle of Times Square. In 1963, Joe Bonanno makes plans with Joseph Magliocco to assassinate several rivals on the Mafia Commission. When Magliocco gives the contract to one of his top hitmen, Joseph Colombo, Colombo reveals the plot to the commission members. With Joe Bonanno missing, the commission soon loses its patience, thinking they're being played by the elusive boss. They rule that Bonanno would no longer be considered head of his family and appoint Capo Gaspar di Gregorio as the new boss of the Bonanno crime family. Di Gregorio had his own beef with Joe Bonanno for earlier denying him the position of family consigliere, which he felt he deserved. Instead, Joe Bonanno had appointed his own son, Bill, Family members, they took sides, splitting into two camps. The Bonanno loyalists, led by Bill Bonanno, and the commission-backed faction, led by De Gregorio. Harsh words led to armed attacks on the streets of New York. The other families were in opposition of these public outbursts. The Bonanno War drew unwanted attention to mob activity for everybody. They wanted the violence to end. So De Gregorio calls for a sit-down to put together a peace treaty. Representatives from both camps agreed to meet at a house on Troutman Street in Brooklyn after dark. De Gregorio and his men arrived first, but striking a deal was not on their minds. As soon as Bill Bonanno and his team showed up, De Gregorio's men opened fire with shotguns and rifles. Bonanno and his men retaliated, shooting into the dark at their unseen attackers. Over 100 rounds were fired, and by some miracle, no one died. Joe Bonanno then offers the commission a deal to end the violence. He'd give up his claim to the family and retire to Arizona if the commission would accept his son Bill and brother-in-law Frank Labruzzo as boss and underboss. The commission saw right through his offer, knowing that Joe Bonanno would remain in control of the family, even if he did not have the title. So they came back with a counteroffer. Bonanno could retire with his life, but the commission would name the next boss, Gaspar de Gregorio. The war continued. Now, Joseph Bonanno resurfaced in May of 1966, 19 months after his alleged kidnapping, then quickly dropped out of sight again. The commission grew impatient with De Gregorio's ineffective efforts to suppress the Bonanno loyalists, so they replaced him with someone they felt could do the job, Paul Shaka. Little good did that do. The bloodshed continued. 3 of Shaka's men were slaughtered by machine gun fire at a Queens restaurant. The fighting just kept escalating, and each camp lost a half dozen more men. In 1968, Joe Bonanno suffers a major heart attack. He flies to Arizona and informs the commission he is retiring, this time for good. The commission was naturally weary of anything Bonanno said or did. As time passed, the shooting stopped, and the torn family eventually accepted Shaka as their leader. In 1969, in an attempt to restore order to the Bonanno family, the commission appoints a 3-man panel to run the family. This panel includes Philip Ristelli, Joseph De Filippi, and Natalie Joe Diamond's Evola. On August 28, 1973, Bonanno boss Natalie Evola dies from cancer on February 23, 1974, at a meeting at the Americana Hotel in Manhattan. The commission names Philip Ristelli boss, Nicholas Marigello underboss, and Stefano Stevie Beef Canone consigliere. Between his release from prison in January of 1974 and his lunch appointment on July 12, 1979, at Joe and Mary's restaurant over there on Knickerbocker Avenue in Brooklyn, Carmine Galante led a hectic schedule. January 23, 1974, after serving 12 years of his 20-year sentence, Carmine is released on parole. The very next day, on January 24th, he makes his presence felt by blowing the doors off the private mausoleum of his enemy, Frank Costello, in St. Michael's Cemetery. Costello died in 1973. Carmine was apparently unhappy with Costello for his role in the removal and banishment of his mentor, Joe Bonanno. When Carmine is paroled in 74, he finds only an interim chief of the Bonanno organization in place. Carmine, being Carmine, despite Philip Rastelli's appointment as boss, assumes control of the Bonanno family by means of what corporate America would call a hostile takeover. Rastelli, who is no lightweight in the realm of gangsterism, resists the takeover until March 17th of that year. His stepson, James Fernandez, who is in no way mobbed up, is gunned down in broad daylight in front of his clothing shop in Brooklyn. Rusty gets the message and gives up the mantle. But as it turned out, the move would only be temporary. Now, when Carmine returns to New York, management of the crew in Canada had begun to evolve away from him. The two-man ruling panel he and Joe Bonanno appointed back in the 50s, the Calabrian, Vincenzo Catroni, and the Sicilian, Luigi Greco, who were able to impart a striking level of stability, was deteriorating by this time. Internationally, the underworld had realigned in Carmine's absence. The French Connection, their large-scale heroin trafficking operation, moving drugs from Indochina through Turkey and France, ultimately reaching the US and Canada, was unraveling. The European traffickers had spread through Europe and South America and formed direct alliances with the Bonanno and Gambino families in New York, if not the other families as well, without Carmine. Carmine, now in his mid-60s, ramps up the narcotics trade while plotting war against his rivals. He holds the Gambinos and their boss, Carlo Gambino, in particular contempt because of their long-standing rivalry with the Bonannos and because the Gambinos have been muscling in on the Bonanno drug empire. On March 6, 1975, Philip Rastelli is indicted on racketeering charges involving extortion. 9 years earlier, he had created a trade association of lunch wagon operators and had taken control of that industry. Any operator who refused to join the association and pay its heavy fees faced vandalism and physical assault. On April 23, 1976, Rastelli is convicted of extortion in United States District Court for the East District of New York. On August 27th of that year, Rastelli is sentenced to 10 years in prison served consecutively to a 4-year state sentence for conspiracy, criminal contempt of court, and usury. He was imprisoned in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. While there, his main contacts to the Bonanno family were mobsters Dominic Sonny Black Napolitano and Joe Messino. When Rastelli is sent to prison in 1976, Carmine assumes control of the Bonanno family as unofficial street boss, and in turn becoming de facto boss. Carmine takes the unusual step, one not appreciated by other Bonanno family members, of surrounding himself with Sicilian-born mafioso like Cesare Bonventure, Salvatore Catalano, and Baldo Amato. These men were called Zips by the American Mafia due to the quick way they zipped through the Italian language. These Zips were heavily involved in the drug trade and in direct opposition to those in the Genovese crime family, which was run by Frank Funzi Thierry, every bit as cunning and vicious as Galante. After spending a decade in prison, Carmine no longer drove. He always had a driver pick him up and drop him off. At times, his bodyguards would drive. Other times, his daughter Nina would play chauffeur. On this day, Carmine is driven around town in a white overred caddy by his nephew, who lived out on Long Island. They drive from Manhattan to Bath Avenue, Brooklyn, in an Oldsmobile, bearing Jersey plates. Carmine visits the Magic Lantern, a bar owned by his son-in-law, Nina's husband. Inside the Magic Lantern, Carmine was observed talking to swarthy men in Sicilian accented Italian. It looked like he was conducting business. These swarthy men were Knickerbocker Zips, the Sicilian guys who did more than just perform chauffeur and bodyguard duties. Carmine gave them capo status so they could operate with their own crews. They had their headquarters in a variety of pizza parlors and pastry shops up and down Knickerbocker Avenue, over there in Bushwick. With the Bonanno family in disarray, ranks depleted, the Zips formed the infrastructure for a new family, Lilo's family. Meanwhile, Carmine is conducting business out of the Magic Lantern. One of those businesses includes nursing an old grudge against Gambino underboss Aniello Delacroce. Delacroce had whacked a couple of Carmine's heroin dealers. In turn, Carmine began chipping away at Gambino power, demanding a piece of the action in Manhattan sweatshops. He then takes over a betting and loan sharking racket, operating in Penn Station, netting $500,000 a year. He would often spend his weekends gardening, enjoying his love of plants, which he had developed during his long incarceration in federal prison on that drug conviction. The FBI kept him under observation, jogging near the East River Drive, moving in and out of L&T Cleaners on Elizabeth Street in Little Italy, one of the businesses he owned, stopping to choose fruit at his favorite grocer in the village, Balducci's, or lingering over an espresso and pastries at De Roberts on First Avenue, before lunching at Tre Amic Restaurant on 3rd Avenue. They would watch him as he walked through the streets of Lower Manhattan, like a patriarchal don, moving through the village in Sicily, balding and with a bent walk, puffing on the perennial cigar, his people approaching him to touch his arm or bow in reverence. When Carmine got out of prison, he and his Knickerbocker crew started a terror campaign never before seen. At first, his primary targets were the Cherry Hill Gambinos, but his wrath, it would extend far beyond firebombing pizzerias throughout the Northeast. On the night of July 6th, 1977, Vincenzo Fortolino and Octavio Ramirez pumped 210 gallons of gasoline into Giuseppe's Pizza restaurant in Ambler, Pennsylvania. They had intended to light a fuse and watch the building go up from a safe distance. Instead, they got careless. There was nothing left of Octavio Ramirez but biscuit-sized pieces. The second arsonist, Vincenzo Fortolino of Brooklyn, he was unharmed and identified as the 22-year-old nephew of Giovanni Fortolino, a member of the Bonanno family. The bombings, according to police intelligence, was one of dozens of torch jobs, blowing up pizza parlors in Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and New York. They believed Carmine was orchestrating a move to push the Gambino family out of the cheese business. This was an extremely lucrative operation, supplying hundreds of restaurants across the tri-state area, one that Joe Bonanno controlled way back in the day. By far, It was Carmine's ambition to control the heroin trade that brought him into direct conflict with the other mafia families. He wanted to bypass the traditional mafia structure, creating his own network of drug trafficking and distribution, cutting out the other families and their share of the profits. This move created resentment and fear among the other mafia bosses. This fear only grew when Carmine allegedly had members of the Gambino family murdered in an effort to cement his power in the drug trade. You don't know how mean this fuck is, Donnie. Lilo, this motherfucker, he's one mean son of a bitch. He's a fucking tyrant. That's just me telling you. It don't go no further than this. A lot of people hate this motherfucker. They feel he's only out for himself. He's the only one making any fucking money. There's only a few people he's close to. And mainly it's them fucking zips. Like Cesare and the mothers you see around Toyland. Those guys are always with him. He brought them over from Sicily. And he uses them for different pieces of work. And for dealing all that fucking junk. They're as fucking mean as he is. You can't trust those bastard zips. Nobody can. Except the old fuck. I mean, he can trust them because he brought them over here. And he can control them. Everybody else has to stay clear of him. I'm telling you, Donnie. There's a lot of people out there who would like to see this cocksucker get whacked. After 1977 New York Times expose detailing his rise as a mafia don and an FBI target, Carmine was so confident in his power that he didn't bother to carry a gun. He remarked to a journalist, "No one would ever kill me. They wouldn't dare. If they want to call me boss of bosses, that's all right. Between you and me, all I do is grow tomatoes." It became clear what Carmine's ultimate goal was when he bragged about becoming capo di tutti capi. Fearing a power grab, boss of the Genovese crime family, Frank Funzi Thierry, he begins contacting Cosa Nostra leaders to build a consensus for Carmine's murder. The commission, the governing body of the mafia, saw Carmine as a threat to their power and stability, a rogue element who was disrupting the delicate balance of power within the underworld, a loose cannon who needed to be eliminated. While Carmine swaggered around the streets of New York, the other bosses held a meeting in Boca Raton, Florida, deciding Carmine's fate. At this meeting, were Funzi Thierry, top member of the Genovese crime family, Jerry Cattina, boss of the Gambino family, Paul Castellano, and Florida boss, Santo Trafficante, amongst others. These powerful men voted unanimously. If mob peace were to exist on the streets of New York City, Carmine Galante had to go. Philip Rastelli, who was still in jail, and Joseph Bonanno, living in Arizona, were consulted. Both signed off on Galante's contract. With this unanimous vote, Carmine Galante's days were numbered. On this hot July afternoon, in the summer of '79, as his nephew James Galante drives away from the drop-off, Carmine walks towards the nondescript eatery, Joe and Mary's Italian-American restaurant, reportedly offered good food and was family-run. It was a favorite meeting place where he often arranged sit-downs with his closest associates. He was back in the volcano, as Joe Bonanno used to refer to New York, and he had less than 3 hours to live.